Concerns are mounting that Nigeria's newly enacted tax laws contain errors, gaps, and inconsistencies that could undermine revenue targets and weaken investor confidence if left unresolved. Key issues including the taxation of nominal capital gains without adjusting for inflation, restrictive rules on foreign exchange, expense deductions, VAT-linked expense disallowances, and unclear provisions affecting non-resident companies. In a high inflation, foreign exchange constrained environment, these measures risk raising effective tax burdens, distorting business decisions, and discouraging foreign investment. Recent equity market sell-offs in late 2025 highlighted investor sensitivity to tax policy uncertainty. Analysts say clearer guidance, alignment with international treaties, and targeted amendments are needed to balance revenue mobilization with competitiveness and sustainable economic growth. Martin Zaroge, partner and head of Power and ESG Tax Sector, KPMG, in Nigeria, joins us now for the conversation. And briefly, if you can walk us through some of the discrepancies or the challenges that your firm highlighted.
Thanks. I'm not sure I would use the word discrepancies or challenges, even though I understand that in terms of the news, those are the sort of words that tend to drive headlines. But that's not really what the focus is when it comes to the tax reform. One thing I would say is that we are all aligned in one particular direction, which is that we want to see the reforms become successful. We want to see economic growth in Nigeria because all of us, we all are impacted by whatever happens in the country. And that's primarily what has driven that publication in terms of us identifying certain issues that we believe may have an impact. It's not about discrepancy or errors. It's more around some maybe unintended impacts. But at the end of the day, how these things work this is very large scale reform, as you may be aware. We are looking at a system and tax laws whose foundation are a number of decades old and may no longer be relevant when it comes to today's business world. Therefore, it was actually apt that the government decided to take this up and do a holistic reform of the tax laws. Again, like I said, it's not about discrepancies or errors. It's just about an engagement around what may or may not be the impact of some of these changes and how businesses may react to some of these changes.
And there is a place for engagement. There was a 6-month window for public sensitization and discussions before implementation, but it's now that it's been implemented that we are seeing some of these reports come out. The report was engaged by the chairman of the Tax Reform Committee himself, Taiwo Oyedele. Are you satisfied with the clarifications that were made?
Again, so if you look at it from the angle of right or wrong, that's when you ask the question around satisfaction with the clarification. But there is no right or wrong. With every tax law, with every law generally, you would always have opinions for or against. You would always have impact and consequences. So it's not about right or wrong. It's not about satisfaction or dissatisfaction. What the chairman has basically done is set out what government's key policy direction were when they conceived some of those changes. And it's then up to businesses to listen, appreciate the government's policy direction, and then decide how best to manage their own operations in order to ensure that at every point in time, they remain on-site and online with their tax obligations in country.
Yes, we do know that there is a need for trust in all of this. KPMG is not the only firm or individual that has noticed one or two ambiguities or so. But I think the question now would be, how best do you reckon this situation can be managed? The government has said they are going to go ahead with implementation regardless, and implementation started 1st of this year. But how best do you think that this committee and the government can secure public acceptance of these new tax laws?
Okay. We also don't think that implementation should stop. Again, like I said, it's a holistic. It's I lost it for a bit. It's a holistic, large-scale reform. There would always be conversations. There would always be discussions. There would always be consequences, some intended, some unintended. So that conversation will not stop. KPMG's publication has started some degree of conversation. I'm almost certain that as we go along on a day-by-day basis, businesses would continue to interact with the committee. An implementation committee has also been set up by the federal government. And that's because the government also understands that the work does not stop with just passage of the law. Implementing the law is also another phase of work. And that's why the government has set up an implementation committee that would be working with government, working with businesses to understand how this play out, both from an intended and unintended consequence perspective, and then, if necessary, make certain changes to reflect market dynamics and market perception going forward. So I think government understands that already. Again, like I said, that's why they've set up the implementation committee. So it's about engagement. It's about everybody listening to everybody and just having those conversations. At the end of the day, we are all on the same team.
All right. One of the key things that was brought forward is the rules governing indirect transfer of shares by non-resident investors. How clear are these rules, and what uncertainties perhaps remain?
Okay, so I don't think that there's any lack of clarity regarding that rule. The rule is clear, and I'll give you, tax has always been dynamic all over the world. A few years ago, we didn't have any tax on the transfer of shares. And so what you will then see in that era was that if I had a very, an asset that formed a significant portion of my holdings, and I wanted to dispose that asset, in order to be able to avoid tax, or mitigate my tax exposure, one of the options that you would see, or you would have found people do at that particular point in time, is hive that asset to a related party, and then sell the shares of that related party. By so doing, I would have transferred ownership of that asset without transfer, indirectly. That's tax avoidance scheme. The government sought to close when we decided to start imposing capital gains tax on shares. So all of this is about dynamism. And the government is saying, we've also seen particular situations where if you can sell shares in Nigeria. However, you could also have instances where there is a holding company outside of Nigeria. And that holding company, the only thing it does is that it holds shares of an entity here in Nigeria. So if you sell the shares of that entity outside of the country, you are indirectly just selling the business in Nigeria. So it's also another form of tax avoidance. And government is just trying to close that loophole. Now, it's not ambiguous. It's just a loophole that the government has identified that are looking to close. So you can, again, talk about consequences and unintended consequences. Does this mean that people would stop coming to make investments in Nigeria, or will it have no impact whatsoever? What I would say to you is this. People do not decide on investment decisions solely based on tax criteria, or solely because there will be a capital gains tax when they dispose. It's a much more complex decision-making process that you will find across any investment arm as to where they put their money and why. So it will not purely be driven by tax considerations or whether there is a capital gains tax in Nigeria or not. So the jury is out as to how this would impact or how this would play when you then put this in the bucket of other considerations, when investors are making that decision around where they put their money in. But there is no ambiguity about it. It's government saying, from a policy perspective, we want to ensure that those who come and set up the holding company in Nigeria and those who set it up in any other country, nobody is worse off from a tax perspective. Again, like I said, it's about consequences, not necessarily about right or wrong.
Of course, we're going to see how the markets themselves or itself responds to all this. We've already seen a bit of that late last year. We know that the intention of this reform is, well, to redistribute wealth, but some are not perceiving it that way. So how do you think policymakers can balance aggressive revenue mobilization, because yes, it is also to raise revenue, with competitiveness and long-term economic growth, so that people don't just see it as a burden, but see it in the long term for their economic prosperity?
That's $1 million question. If I had the answer to that question, I probably would not be sitting down here. Everywhere in the world, that's a question everyone is asking. If you look at the One Big Beautiful Bill in the US, even in Donald Trump's first term, the tax reforms that were passed, it was all about how do we balance competitiveness with also raising tax revenues. And that's a conversation you would always have people on both extreme sides of the divide. You have people who say, we need smaller governments, less tax, and then we leave individuals and corporations to go about their own activities as much as possible and focus on growth and economic development. And you would always have people on the other side of the divide that say, there would always be vulnerable people in our society. So we need to collect from corporations and high net worth individuals and use that as a base to provide for the vulnerable. Again, like I said, it's a century-old conversation. No matter where you tilt to, you would never win that conversation. So it's an ongoing process, tweaking here and there to see how, as far as possible, how you can continue to incentivize growth without necessarily taxing the drivers of that growth in a way and manner that they begin to then flee from the economy. There again, it's neither a right or wrong answer. It's all about perspective and consequence.
All right, and we'll get into some of those consequences and also try to clear up some of the misinformation around these reforms in just a moment. Martins Orege, do stay with us. Fear around Nigeria's new tax reforms is largely driven by misinformation and poor understanding of the law, or so some say. We have Martins Orege, partner and head Power and ESG Tax Sector KPMG in Nigeria, who is joining us to clear things up. One of the areas of misunderstanding, and thank you for staying with us, is the VAT-linked expense disallowance. How practical is that VAT-linked expense disallowance in an economy with a large informal sector?
Okay. My personal opinion is that if we want the economy to grow, we need to, as much as possible, begin to take steps to shrink the informal sector and bring more and more people into the formal sector. Businesses would have greater access to credits and also greater ability to scale and therefore contribute more.
All right, it appears we're having... All right. Are you there, Martins?
Yes, I am. I can hear you.
All right. If you can just briefly pick up from where you left off.
Yeah, so I was saying my personal view is that the more people we bring from the informal to the formal sector, the more likely that we are able to incentivize or to drive growth. When you are in the informal sector, access to credit is a whole lot more limited, and therefore your ability to scale is also restricted. So I think it's in light of this that government has decided that if we place the burden on large corporations to ensure that whatever transactions they engage in, if they don't suffer or are not charged VAT, they will not be able to take a deduction for it. Now, what it would drive is that these large corporations will primarily then begin to insist that all of their vendors are registered and all of their vendors are able to issue them with a VAT invoice. And by registering these businesses, you stand the chance that you are able to transit them from the informal to the formal sector, because there's a whole lot more information that will be out there available to government and its agencies about these entities once they are registered for VAT. So that's government's own perception in terms of if we can force these people, if we can drive people from the informal into the formal sector, it would basically help us drive growth. It would also help them have greater access to tools and credit that enables them also scale their businesses. So if that is successful, it would be a win-win for everybody. However, from a large corporation perspective, there are some concerns because they are saying, why would we be the ones to suffer if these guys don't register? Because we need their services. We've engaged them. We've paid for those services. We can prove that we've paid for the services. So we think it should not be us that should suffer if they don't register or charge VAT. Again, like I said, it's about policy direction, is about consequences. But I can see where government is coming from. I can also see where the large corporations are coming from. But we all just need to find a way to make it work.
Indeed, the debate continues, engagement continues, and hopefully we meet somewhere in the middle. But thank you so much for your perspective and the clarifications you made on the show this morning. Martins Aroge, Partner and Head, Power and ESG Tax Sector, KPMG in Nigeria.